Hello and welcome back to NoBS. Today we're talking about another thing being called out by these PC SJW-led outrage mobs. They've been going after everything in the past few weeks in a sort of fever pitch. They've kind of had a fire sale on their side because they started to get support in response to these terrible events that first spurred out of Minneapolis and then later Atlanta, and then they spread and it caused unrest in many, many big cities across the country. This has emboldened the leftists who are now getting attention and basically going after everything. Companies are starting to cave in all over the place. They're giving out messages when they're getting forced into them. Lego has removed their cop-based play sets because, cops are supposed to be offensive now. Other things have changed. Gone with the Wind was taken off of HBO Max. Now it's put back up with a warning label, stuff like that. Everything is under attack. Everything is being scrutinized. And today we're talking about another example. Today we're talking about a game called Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is a long-time board game you play with your friends. You have pieces and cards and stuff like that. I'm not actually super familiar with the game. I've always heard of it. It's always been around in the background. I've seen them play it on Stranger Things, was a thing that had a Dungeons and Dragons set up recently. And yes, it's just this old game. It's been around forever. And it's kind of similar. I would say it's similar to like a Lord of the Rings vibe because they have these kinds of magic characters battling these other monsters and other wizards and stuff like that. And that's the kind of thing that's gotten them under fire. Recently, people have made calls to defend the Orcs in that game. There's this race of monster creatures called Orcs in the game, kind of similar to the Orcs that are in Lord of the Rings. And in Dungeons and Dragons, they're this bad group of people too. But since that's now offensive to kind of call someone an evil race, that's now being changed and the game has sort of caved in and they're basically kowtowing to get more publicity. I think it's a publicity stunt and it's keeping them alive in this modern, very PC age. This article has more details. It's from PC Gamer. Here's their first tweet. It says, D&D is getting rid of the concept of evil races right from the get-go. Pretty ridiculous. We're talking about a long-running game. We're talking about these monster creatures, or there's other races in these worlds, like there's elves, there's the human races, there's like hobbits. Again, I might be getting a little confused with the stuff that's in Lord of the Rings because it reminds me of that a lot. So let's go ahead and get to the article then and get the specifics, and we can see where this is going. D&D is trying to move away from racial stereotypes. It's getting rid of the concept of evil races and making changes to racial ability scores. Now, this is something I've heard about recently too. I think Magic the Gathering was another game that had to remove some of their cards. Some of their pieces are just not playing well with this kind of woke culture we're in. The problem is politically correct nature. The left is deleting our history and they're trying to rewrite things and doing this very, very Marxist, like communist move where they tear down our statues, they remove history and, media that they don't like. They cancel this movie, this show, this game we're talking about today. And that's the real problem. It's not that these things are actually super offensive or racist at all. Usually they're not. Usually it's just overblown and, them kind of looking too far into things. D&D's fantasy races are often painted in broad strokes, ensuring that if you ever need a cunning villain, you can always just grab a drow. Or maybe an orc if you need a monstrous warrior with an anger problem. Wizards of the Coast says it's trying to put an end to that, however, in an attempt to make tabletop game more inclusive. In a blog published last week, the publisher outlined some of the changes it's already made, as well as steps it's planning to take. D&D 5th edition is easily the most accessible and inclusive edition of the game, but there's still loads of room for improvement. 2016's Curse of Strahd, for instance, contained the Vistani, a group made from Romani tropes, and one that exacerbated negative stereotypes. Wizards of the Coast has made changes to Curse of Strahd, and it's also planning to explore the Vistani further in 2 upcoming books with assistance of a Romani consultant. Okay, again, we're already getting into points where we're in crazy town. We're talking about a children's game. Some teens and adults play it too, but it's a little game. It's Dungeons and Dragons. It's played on a board. People do it at comic book shops if those are still around. I don't know. That's the way I used to see it as a kid. It was like comic book shops and people playing cards. I used to play Pokemon cards though. I was a Pokemon guy. That might make me sound better or worse. I'm not really sure. Pokemon was always more accessible to me, more interesting. Nothing wrong with Dungeons and Dragons though. It's just, it's this little kind of niche kind of group and they're getting taken over because they're just trying to pander. And we know that Wizards of the Coast has had a lot of issues with that in the past too. And it's just ridiculous. Like we're talking about orcs, we're talking about monster characters. Like these guys are like just bloodthirsty. They're like the worst kind of just a go-to villain. I don't see why they want to like, oh, let's get the nuance of that. Like let's get some motivation for those orcs. There's good orcs too. Like it's just so silly to me. The more fantastical races aren't free from these issues either. Wizards of the Coast acknowledges that the language often used to describe some races are painfully reminiscent of how real-world ethnic groups have been and continue to be denigrated. Eberron, Rise of the Last War, and Explorer's Guide to Wildemont. These names and words are so hard to read sometimes. Okay, both published in the last year, paint Drowan orcs as just as complex as other races. And apparently that's how they'll be presented going forward. So now I'm getting like also there's like a World of Warcraft kind of vibe too. Like it reminds me of that World of Warcraft game, how it came back. And then also like how South Park would goof on that and they talk about all these like elves to drow and, like there's the orc race. And then, but this is exactly what I was predicting just a few minutes ago. I was saying they're trying to give them nuance to these like monsters. It's basically like if you did the same thing to like 1940s Germans, you're like, oh, but there's nuance to that. Like you got to say this or that. It's like, no, they wouldn't accept that. But when it comes to orcs, it's like, oh yeah, we got to be careful. As well as changing how it approaches future books and the language they use. There will also be changes to your characters. Wizards of the Coast is planning to offer a way for players to customize their character's origin and make changes to their racial ability score. Races get different ability bonuses, the elves being especially dexterous, but you'll be able to pick a different bonus that better reflects your character. The option emphasizes that each player in the game is an individual with capabilities all their own, says Wizard. As well as being less restrictive, it feels more in keeping with the 5th edition that places storytelling above mass. A+1 modifier isn't what makes a character or a group of people interesting. When the option will be available hasn't been announced yet, but it's coming later this year. So they're really like revamping the whole game. They're really going all in on this kind of racial, like fairness, like awareness kind of thing. Like I think most people didn't care. I don't think anyone was really concerned about this. I know there were some stories, like of course there's always going to be a few SJWs calling something racist. That happens. And I've heard this orc thing actually brought up in the last few weeks. There was stories about it like a month or so ago. And now it's popping up again. And it's basically, I think, the way I see it, it's Wizard of the Coast and the Dungeons and Dragons people like trying to get relevant. They're trying to virtue signal and say, hey, we're woke. We're fixing our race problem. Like, check us out. Like, come buy our toys again. Come play our game. Read this book. It's just kind of a publicity stunt. And it's just empty, like, useless, like, oh, they're not really saving the world like they claim. I mean, you might be playing for that in the game. In the game, you could be this hero who has to save the world from villains or something, but that's not what they're doing here. Here, they're just being silly and caving into this outrage mob, and they don't need any more cave-ins. Like, the outrage mob is already too confident. They've already taken down Aunt Jemima. They've already made Lady Antebellum, some southern band, change their name. Like, everything is going down in flames. And just to see another thing like this kind of nerd culture D&D thing go down as well is really, really upsetting. More importantly, but given less prominence in the post, Wizard says it's seeking new, diverse talent to work on the game, and it's brought in new people who apparently reflect the beautiful diversity of D&D. They're all sound steps, so hopefully Wizard nails the follow-through. For a game fueled by imagination, D&D can be extremely stodgy at times, so it's good to see it lurching forward and shaking off some of its baggage. This is written by Fraser Brown at PC Gamer. He seems on board for this. He's Scottish. He also looks like a total soy boy. I'm not sure what the comments are going to say here. This guy's debating the concept of good and evil. It kind of negates the whole concept if you think about it. I see him going into it saying that the part of fantasy, this is like taking away some part of the fantasy. Like the whole point of these kinds of stories is it's real clear cut who's good and bad. There's not that kind of nuance. And there can be, these characters can be deep and people can possibly like switch sides or have some sort of betrayal. But the point is what makes the fantasy good. And I agree with this guy. It's like, you got to know who the villain is. Like Batman fights the Joker. There's no like questioning him and going in about it. Like, yeah, the Joker movie, there was a Joker movie last year, of course, and it gave us some kind of backstory to him, but it wasn't as sympathetic as many would say. Like some try to claim it was trying to make him like a hero, and he could be some kind of anti-hero, but he clearly goes mad and becomes a killer. Like, you need to have clear-cut heroes and villains, to make your fantasy like as powerful as it can be. And this comment, this top comment, is already nailing it and showing how this is drawing it closer to reality, as the end of his post says. So we don't want to be in reality. We want to be in a fantasy land fighting dragons and whatever, using magical spells to save a princess. That's the kind of fantasy you want to have. You don't want to be thinking, oh, but is the orcs are should we really be bad about them? Like that's more of like a different kind of thing. Like I'm maybe like a sci-fi thing. That kind of reminds me of a lot of things in Mass Effect is a sci-fi, and it's also fantasy in a lot of ways too. But it's also more of like an adult kind of story, more complex, and you are kind of questioning whether your villains are really villains. But at the end of the day, even in that story, there's a lot of different groups that are warring and they have nuance, but there's still that main villain character, that citadel that's coming after them, and then the alien race that's trying to destroy them all. Like there's still a clear-cut villain. So to have it like this is really undermining the whole fantasy. Someone says there will be a lot of pearl clutching by white wing Trump tards in this comment section. Yeah, that's kind of what we're doing, I guess. I mean, I wouldn't put us that way, but we are kind of clapping back. We're saying this is silly. It undermines the core principles of the game and fantasy. It's also giving in to the outrage mob, which has gotten too much power and clout already. So this is why the story's bad. I think you guys get the point. That about wraps things up. Let's make sure to comment all our thoughts and everything below. Let me know what you're thinking. Let's see what's going on in this story in your heads. And then also hit the like button, get this video shared. Check out our second channel, NoBS News. We got extra videos there every weekday, live streams too. Have a great day, everyone.